Alina hotly found the message at 6 in the morning, and her hands did not stop shaking for an hour. It was not even a long message. 4 words on a screen that should have been locked. 4 words that undid 11 years in a single breath. She had picked up Richard's phone only to silence an alarm, and instead she had opened a door into a room she never wanted to see. She did not scream. She did not throw anything. She sat on the edge of the bed with the phone still warm in her palm and stared at the wall until the sun came up properly and turned the curtains gold. Richard was still asleep beside her, one arm thrown over his eyes, breathing slow and even, a man with nothing on his conscience. Alina studied his face the way a stranger might study a photograph in a newspaper, trying to find the crime in the features, and finding only a man she used to trust completely. She put the phone back exactly where she had found it, screen down, same angle. She was already learning to hide what she knew, and she hated herself a little for how easily it came. She thought back over the past few months, searching for signs she had missed, the way people always do once they know what they are looking for. The late meetings that ran longer than they used to. The phone that had started living face down on every surface. The new cologne she had noticed once and dismissed as nothing, a small indulgence, a man treating himself to something pleasant. None of it had seemed significant at the time. All of it seemed obvious now, arranged in a neat, damning row. She thought, too, of the early years, before the house on Aldgate Row, before the business grew large enough to fill every waking hour of Richard's attention. They had been poorer then, and happier, in the small flat above the bakery where the smell of bread woke them every morning instead of an alarm. She remembered a version of Richard who had once driven 3 hours in the middle of the night simply because she had called him crying after a difficult day, a man who had shown up without being asked. She wondered, sitting there in the gray early light, exactly when that man had quietly left the marriage, and whether she had failed to notice his absence because she had been too busy building a life around the man who replaced him. By the time Richard woke, she had made coffee, ironed his shirt, and rehearsed her own face in the bathroom mirror until it gave nothing away. She had always been good at composure. It was, perhaps, the thing that had first made him fall for her, all those years ago, the calm at the center of every storm. Now that same calm felt like a mask nailed to her skull. "You're up early," Richard said, stretching oblivious. "Big day," Alina said. "The Ashworth Garden party." He groaned, but it was a performance of a groan, the kind married people do for each other out of habit. "Right. I forgot that was today." "You didn't forget," Alina said, and something in her voice made him look up. She smiled before he could ask why. "You never forget a party where people who matter will see you." He laughed, missing the blade under the words, and went to shower. Alina stood in the kitchen with her hands flat on the cold counter, and made herself breathe. She had built a life in this house. Every cushion, every photograph on the wall, every choice of paint had been made with care, made to say something about who they were as a couple. Now she wondered how much of it had been true and how much of it had simply been convenient for him. She thought about canceling the party. She thought about staying home, drawing the curtains, and letting the day pass in silence while she decided what to do with the wreckage in her chest. But some old, stubborn part of her refused to give Richard the satisfaction of her hiding. If he had a secret, she would not be the one who disappeared. She dressed with more care than usual. A soft green dress, tailored at the waist, the color of new leaves, pearl earrings that had belonged to her mother. She did her makeup with a steady hand, though inside she felt anything but steady, and by the time she was finished, the woman in the mirror looked like she had never received a single piece of bad news in her life. Richard came down in a linen suit, looking pleased with himself in a way that now made her stomach turn. "You look beautiful," he said, and kissed her cheek, and she let him because that was easier than the alternative. The drive to the Ashworth estate took 40 minutes, most of it in silence. Richard talked about business contacts he hoped to see, potential investors, the usual noise he made before any important social event. Alina watched the hedgerows blur past the window and said the right things at the right moments without hearing herself say them. She did not yet know the name Camille Voss. She did not yet know that in a few hours she would stand in front of dozens of people she had known for years and feel the ground disappear beneath her feet. All she knew, as the car turned through the iron gates of the estate, was that something in her marriage had cracked open that morning, and she had no idea yet how wide that crack would become before the day was over. The Ashworth Garden Party was, every summer, the event that decided who still mattered in that particular corner of society. Marquees striped in cream and gold lined the lawn. A string quartet played somewhere near the roses. Waiters moved through the crowd with trays of champagne that caught the light like something out of an old film. Alina had attended this party for 9 years running, ever since Richard's business had grown large enough to earn them an invitation. She knew most of the guests by name, knew their spouses, their children, the small dramas that moved beneath the surface of every polite conversation. She had always found comfort in that familiarity. Today it felt like walking into a room full of people who might already know something she did not. They were greeted at the entrance by Lady Priscilla Ashworth herself, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, who kissed Alina on both cheeks and told her the dress was divine. Alina thanked her and meant it, grateful for one honest, uncomplicated moment before she had to face the rest of the afternoon. Richard was pulled away almost immediately by a cluster of men in expensive suits, all eager to discuss a new development project on the edge of town. Alina watched him go, watched the easy charm slide over his face like a second skin, and wondered how much of that charm had been rehearsed on someone else. She spent a while making the rounds herself, greeting the wives and daughters and old family friends she had known for years, admiring a new grandchild in one conversation, praising a newly renovated kitchen in another, performing the same small rituals of belonging she had performed at this party 9 times before. It usually came easily to her, this gentle choreography of a summer afternoon, but today every compliment felt like it required effort to produce, every laugh a fraction late arriving. She passed the long table where the older women of the county always gathered to watch the party unfold, and old Mrs. Whitfield caught her arm gently as she went by. "You look tired, dear," the old woman said, not unkindly. "Is everything well at home?" "Everything's wonderful," Alina said, and the lie came out so smoothly it frightened her a little. She found a quiet spot near the roses and accepted a glass of champagne she did not intend to drink. The garden smelled of cut grass and warm sugar from the dessert table, and for a few minutes she allowed herself to simply stand there, breathing, letting the ordinary beauty of the afternoon hold her together. It was her friend Margaret who first mentioned the name. "Have you met Camille yet?" Margaret asked, appearing at her elbow with 2 small pastries balanced on a napkin. "She's new, works in the Arts Council. Absolutely stunning and knows it if you ask me." "I don't think so," Alina said, and something cold moved through her chest, though she could not have said why. It was only a name. "She's over there," Margaret said, nodding toward the marquee, "with the blue dress. Half the husbands here haven't stopped looking at her since she walked in." Alina followed the direction of Margaret's nod, and for a moment the party seemed to go quiet around her, though of course it had not. The quartet still played, the guests still laughed, only something in Alina's own hearing had narrowed to a single point. The woman in blue was young, younger than Alina by at least 10 years, with dark hair pinned in loose waves and a laugh that carried across the lawn like a bell. She was beautiful in the effortless, infuriating way of someone who had never had to work for it. Alina watched her for a moment longer than she meant to, and then, because she could not have explained why, she looked for Richard. She found him at the edge of the marquee in conversation with a group of men, and she watched his eyes drift, just once, toward the woman in blue. It was brief. It might have meant nothing. A husband's eyes drift at parties and it means nothing most of the time. Except that Alina had seen 4 words on a phone screen that morning, And now those 4 words rearranged themselves in her mind and pointed, unmistakably, toward the woman in blue. She did not confront him. Not yet. She told herself she was imagining things, building a story out of coincidence and fear, the way anxious minds sometimes do. But she found herself watching all afternoon in a way she had never watched at a party before, cataloging every glance, every small movement, gathering evidence she did not want to find. By the time the afternoon sun had softened into gold and the guests had moved toward the long tables set beneath the oldest trees on the estate, Alina had convinced herself, almost, that she had been wrong. Richard had barely spoken to the woman in blue. He had stayed near his business contacts, laughed at their jokes, put his hand once briefly on Alina's back in a gesture that felt almost like reassurance. Almost. She was standing near the dessert table, listening to Margaret describe a disastrous kitchen renovation, when she felt someone step close beside her. "You must be Alina," a voice said, warm and light, with the faint edge of amusement underneath it. "Richard talks about you constantly." Alina turned, and there she was. Camille Voss, up close, was even more striking than she had appeared from a distance, with eyes the color of strong tea and a smile that did not quite reach them. "I don't think we've met," Alina said carefully. "No," Camille agreed, "but I feel like I know you already." She let the sentence hang there, sharp and unfinished, and Alina felt the first cold thread of understanding pull tight in her stomach. "How do you know Richard?" Alina asked, keeping her voice pleasant, though every instinct in her body had gone very still. "Through work," Camille said. "The Arts Council partners with a few of his development projects." She sipped her champagne, unhurried, watching Alina over the rim of the glass with an expression Alina could not quite name, something between curiosity and appetite. "He's very generous with his time." There was a weight to the way she said it, a private joke Alina was not invited to share. And Alina felt, for the first time that day, the ground under her feet tilt very slightly, as though the whole garden had shifted 1 degree to the left. "I'm sure he is," Alina said. Margaret, sensing something in the air she could not identify, made a small excuse and drifted away to refresh her drink, leaving Alina alone with the woman whose name had somehow already found its way into the wreckage of her marriage. "You have a lovely home," Camille said suddenly. "The one on Aldgate Row. Richard showed me pictures once during a meeting, very tasteful." Alina's mouth went dry. She had never given Richard permission to show anyone photographs of their home, their private life, the rooms she had built with her own hands and her own taste over 11 careful years. And yet here was this woman, speaking about her house as though she had already been inside it. "Did he?" Alina said, and it was not a question. Camille smiled, slow and satisfied, and for a moment Alina understood with total clarity that this was not an accident. This was not a chance meeting at a garden party. This woman had come here today knowing exactly who Alina was, and she had wanted, very deliberately, to say these things to her face. "He did," Camille said. "He shows me quite a lot, actually." The quartet, somewhere behind them, moved into a lighter piece, and the sound of it seemed suddenly very far away, as though Alina were hearing it from the bottom of a well. She looked across the lawn and found Richard, laughing at something one of his business partners had said, entirely unaware that his wife was standing 20 feet away, being slowly, deliberately unmade by a stranger in a blue dress. Alina opened her mouth to say something, anything, some sharp reply that would put this woman back in her place, but nothing came. 11 years of careful composure had not prepared her for a moment like this one, and for the first time all day, she felt the mask on her face begin, very slightly, to slip. Camille watched her with the patient interest of a cat watching something small and wounded, and Alina understood in that moment that whatever was about to happen next, it had already been planned. She had walked into this garden thinking the worst thing that might happen was a quiet conversation with her own suspicions. She had not imagined that the mistress herself would seek her out, smiling, unhurried, in front of half the county, with more to say and no intention of stopping. Somewhere near the long tables, Lady Ashworth was calling the guests together for the afternoon toast, her voice bright and carrying across the lawn, and Alina felt Camille's hand rest lightly, almost affectionately, on her arm. "Come," Camille said softly, "you won't want to miss this part." And Alina, still too stunned to pull away, let herself be led toward the crowd gathering beneath the oldest trees on the estate, toward whatever Camille Voss had planned for her next, with no idea that the next few minutes would become the worst of her entire life, watched by every person she had ever tried to impress. The crowd gathered beneath the old oak trees in a loose, golden half-circle, glasses in hand, faces turned toward Lady Ashworth, who stood on a small wooden platform with the easy confidence of a woman who had given this same toast for 30 years running. Alina stood near the front, Camille still close beside her, and Richard somewhere to her left, drawn by the gathering crowd like everyone else, still smiling, still entirely unaware. "Every year," Lady Ashworth began, "this garden reminds me why I love this community. The friendships, the generosity, the people who show up for one another year after year." A polite ripple of applause moved through the crowd. Alina clapped along with everyone else, though her hands felt distant, as though they belonged to someone standing a little apart from her own body. "And this year," Lady Ashworth continued, "I want to do something a little different. I want to celebrate not just old friends but new ones. Camille, darling, would you come up and say a few words about the wonderful work the Arts Council has been doing, with the generous support of some of our most treasured guests?" Alina felt Camille straighten beside her, felt the small current of triumph that moved through the other woman's posture as she stepped forward, smiling, entirely at ease in front of a crowd that did not yet know her the way it knew Alina. "Thank you, Lady Ashworth," Camille said, taking the small stage with the practiced grace of someone who had learned exactly how to hold a room. "It's been such a pleasure this year, working so closely with some of the most generous people in this community." Her eyes moved deliberately toward Richard. Richard Hartley in particular has been incredibly supportive, generous with his time, his resources, his attention. A few people laughed, gently, assuming the comment was simple flattery, the kind exchanged at parties like this one every year. Richard laughed too, raising his glass slightly in acknowledgement, still smiling, still entirely unaware of the trap closing around him. "In fact," Camille went on, her voice light and conversational, as though she were sharing nothing more dangerous than a pleasant anecdote, "he's shown me his home, his office, his whole life, really. It's rare to find someone so willing to open every door." She paused, letting her eyes drift finally toward Alina, and the smile on her face sharpened into something colder. "Isn't that right, Alina?" The crowd's attention turned, as one, toward Alina, and for a moment nobody understood what was happening. It was only a few seconds, but it stretched out endlessly, every face turned toward her, waiting for an answer to a question she did not yet know how to hold. "I'm sorry," Alina said, and her voice, when it came, sounded strange to her own ears, too small for the size of the crowd. "I don't think I understand." "Oh, I think you do," Camille said softly, and there was something almost gentle in the way she said it, gentle the way a knife can be gentle right before it cuts. "Richard's told me so much about you, about the two of you. It feels almost like I already know your whole life." A murmur moved through the crowd, uncertain, curious. The particular hush of a group of people who have just realized they are about to witness something they were not meant to see. Alina felt every eye on her, felt the heat rise in her face, felt Richard, somewhere to her left, go suddenly, terribly still. "Camille," Richard said, his voice low, urgent, a warning disguised as a name. But Camille was not finished. She turned back to the crowd, her tone light again, almost playful, as though she were simply continuing a charming story. "It's such a shame, isn't it, when two people grow so far apart under the same roof? I've heard all about the late nights, the distance, the loneliness. She glanced once more at Alina, and this time there was no gentleness left in her expression at all. "He tells me things he doesn't tell you anymore, Alina. I hope that doesn't come as too much of a surprise." The silence that followed was total. Even the quartet had stopped playing, the musicians froze in mid-note, sensing, as everyone else did, that something irreversible had just happened in front of them. Alina stood at the center of it, in her green dress and her mother's pearl earrings, and felt the entire structure of her carefully built life come apart in front of a crowd of people who had known her for 9 years, people whose good opinion she had spent a decade earning. Someone laughed, a short, nervous sound, quickly swallowed. Someone else whispered something to their companion, too low to hear but unmistakable in its meaning. Margaret, near the back of the crowd, had gone pale, one hand pressed to her mouth. Lady Ashworth herself looked stricken, clearly realizing too late what she had invited onto her small wooden stage. Alina looked for Richard, hopping in some small and foolish corner of her heart, that he would step forward, that he would say something, anything to defend her, to deny it, to put himself between her and the humiliation unfolding in front of the entire garden. But Richard only stood there, his face drained of color, his mouth slightly open, saying nothing at all. His silence was its own confession, louder than anything Camille could have said, and Alina felt it land in her chest like a physical blow. She thought, absurdly, of the coffee she had made him that morning, of the shirt she had ironed, of 11 years of small, ordinary acts of love, all of them suddenly worthless in the face of his silence. She recognized faces in the crowd she had known for years, people whose children she had watched grow up, people who had sat at her own dinner table, and she watched, with a strange, detached clarity, as each of them decided in real time how to react. Some looked away quickly, embarrassed on her behalf, unwilling to witness more than they already had. Others leaned toward their companions, already beginning the low, urgent whispering that would carry this story through the county for weeks to come. A young man near the back, someone she did not recognize, actually raised his phone slightly, and Alina felt a fresh wave of horror at the thought that this moment might exist somewhere beyond memory, captured and shared and replayed long after the garden had emptied for the evening. Her body seemed to belong to someone else entirely. She was aware of her own heartbeat, loud and uneven, aware of the sweat gathering at the back of her neck despite the mild afternoon, aware of every small physical betrayal of the composure she was fighting so hard to maintain. She wanted more than anything to simply disappear, to fold herself into some small, invisible space where no one could see her face and catalog exactly how much this had cost her. But there was nowhere to go. The crowd surrounded her on every side, and running now, she understood instinctively, would only confirm every unkind thing this moment had already suggested about her. "Alina," Camille said again, softer now, almost kind, which somehow made it worse, "I really am sorry if this comes as news." It did not come as news. That was the cruelest part. Alina had already known since 6 in the morning, since 4 words on a phone screen she should never have picked up. But knowing it privately, in the quiet of her own bedroom, was a different thing entirely from having it announced, deliberately, cruelly, in front of every person whose opinion had ever mattered to her. Her hands, she realized, were shaking. Her champagne glass trembled slightly in her grip, and she set it down on the nearest table before she could drop it, before the sound of shattering glass could become one more thing for this crowd to remember about the day Alina Hartley fell apart in front of them. She could feel the tears building behind her eyes, hot and humiliating, and she thought, with sudden desperate clarity, that if she cried now, in front of all of them, she would never be able to walk into a room in this community again. She would be remembered forever as the wife who wept in the garden, the woman who did not know her own husband, the fool who had stood by smiling while her marriage rotted quietly behind closed doors. She looked around the circle of faces, searching for one kind expression, one person who might step forward and ease the weight pressing down on her chest, but everyone seemed frozen in the same uncertain silence, unwilling to intervene, unwilling to look away. And then, from somewhere near the back of the crowd, a voice spoke, calm and clear and utterly unbothered by the tension in the air, and every head in the garden turned toward it, and Alina, for the first time since Camille had begun to speak, felt the smallest flicker of something other than shame move through her chest. The man walking toward the circle moved without hurry, as though the tension in the garden did not touch him at all. He was tall, dressed in a dark gray suit that fit him with the quiet precision of tailoring nobody had to explain, and though Alina had never spoken to him before, she recognized him immediately from the whispers that always followed him through rooms like this one. Alistair Foxmere, the Duke of Foxmere. A man whose presence at any gathering was treated as a small honor, and whose opinion, once given, was rarely questioned by anyone in that garden. He came to stand beside Alina, not in front of her, not behind her, but exactly beside her, as though the two of them had arrived together, as though this had always been his place to stand. The crowd, which had been murmuring uncertainly only a moment before, fell into a different kind of silence, the silence of people suddenly unsure what they were about to witness. "Forgive me for interrupting," he said, his voice pitched to carry without ever seeming to raise itself. "I couldn't help overhearing. Mrs. Hartley, I believe we haven't been introduced properly, though I've admired your work with the River Restoration Committee for some time. Your letter to the council last spring was the most sensible thing anyone said on the subject all year." For a moment, Alina could not understand what was happening. The words made sense individually, but together they seemed to belong to an entirely different conversation, one where she was not standing at the center of her own public unraveling, but simply a woman being complimented on a piece of civic work she had nearly forgotten writing. "Thank you," she managed, because it seemed the only thing to say, though her voice still trembled slightly at the edges. "I wonder," the Duke continued, turning slightly so that his shoulder placed itself, almost imperceptibly, between Alina and Camille, "if you might spare me a few minutes before the toast concludes. I have a proposal I've been meaning to discuss with someone who actually understands the difference between conservation and decoration, and everyone else here seems far more interested in decoration." A ripple of soft laughter moved through the nearest guests, uncertain at first, then relaxing, the sound of people grateful for permission to release the tension that had gathered in their chests. Lady Ashworth, still on the small platform, seized the opening with visible relief. "What a wonderful idea," she said quickly. "Why don't we let Alina and His Grace continue that conversation, and I'll finish up here. Thank you, Camille, for those words." Her tone flattened slightly on the last sentence, a warning disguised as gratitude, and Camille's smile faltered for the first time since she had stepped onto the platform. The Duke offered Alina his arm, an old-fashioned gesture that should have felt strange in the middle of a modern garden party, and yet somehow did not. Alina took it, because she did not trust her own legs to carry her away from that circle without support, and together they walked toward the quieter end of the lawn, past the roses, past the string quartet now beginning, tentatively, to play again, until the noise of the gathering fell away behind them. "You didn't have to do that," Alina said, once they were far enough from the crowd that her voice would not carry. "No," the Duke agreed, "I didn't." "Then why did you?" He considered the question for a moment, as though it deserved a careful answer rather than a quick one. "Because I've known Camille Voss for exactly 4 minutes longer than you have, and in that time I watched her plan every word of what she said up there. Cruelty that has been rehearsed is the worst kind. It deserves to be interrupted." Alina felt something in her chest loosen slightly, though the humiliation of the last several minutes had not disappeared, only shifted, made room for something else to sit beside it. "Everyone saw," she said quietly. "Everyone heard." "They did," the Duke said, without pretending otherwise, which Alina found she appreciated more than any comforting lie could have offered. "But people forget public embarrassment far faster than they remember public grace. Right now you feel as though every person in that garden is thinking about what happened to you. Give it a week, and they'll be thinking about how calmly you walked away from it." Eleanor almost laughed, a strange, watery sound that surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. "I don't feel calm." "You don't have to feel it," he said. "You only have to look it for the next hour or so. Feeling it can come later, somewhere private where it belongs." They had reached a low stone wall at the edge of the garden, overlooking a stretch of meadow that rolled down toward a line of distant trees, and the Duke gestured for her to sit, which she did, grateful for the solid, unmoving stone beneath her after the vertigo of the last quarter hour. "You seem very sure of things most people would hesitate to say out loud," Eleanor said, studying him. "Is that a habit you learned or one you were born with?" "Learned," the Duke said, without hesitation. "I spent most of my 20s saying nothing at moments exactly like this one, watching people I cared about get quietly dismantled in rooms full of people too polite to intervene. I told myself, at the time, that it wasn't my place to say anything. I've come to understand that this was simply a comfortable way of describing cowardice." "Why does it matter to you?" Eleanor asked, watching him carefully. "You don't know me, you don't know Richard. Whatever happens in my marriage is not your concern." The Duke was quiet for a moment, looking out over the meadow rather than at her, which somehow made the honesty of his answer easier to receive. "My sister endured something similar several years ago at a party not unlike this one. Nobody stepped in for her. I have never quite forgiven myself for being one of the people who watched and said nothing." He glanced at her then, and his expression, for the first time since he had approached the circle, showed something unguarded. "I decided a long time ago that if I was ever in a position to change that outcome for someone else, I would." Eleanor did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and for a moment the two of them simply sat in silence, the noise of the party drifting toward them from a distance that felt, suddenly, much greater than the actual length of the lawn. Behind them, near the marquee, Eleanor could hear the tone of the gathering shifting, could hear the particular hum of a crowd exchanging opinions rather than pleasantries, and she understood, with a kind of tired resignation, that the story of what had happened would be repeated at every table for the rest of the afternoon, reshaped and retold, until it barely resembled the truth. "What will you do?" the Duke asked after a while. "I don't know yet," Eleanor admitted. "This morning I found out about her existence. This afternoon the entire county found out along with me. I haven't had time to decide anything." "Take the time," he said simply. "Nobody in that garden has the right to rush your decisions, whatever they are." Eleanor looked at him then, really looked, and found none of the pity in his expression that she had braced herself against, none of the curiosity that so often hid behind sympathy at moments like this one. There was only a kind of steady attention, the look of a man who had said what he meant and expected nothing further in return. "Thank you," she said finally, "for what you did back there." "You don't owe me thanks," the Duke said. "You owed yourself an interruption, and I simply happened to be standing close enough to provide one." From across the lawn, Eleanor saw Richard emerge from the crowd, searching for her, his face still pale, his usual easy confidence entirely stripped away. She felt the Duke notice the direction of her gaze, felt him straighten slightly beside her, not moving to intervene again, but making it clear in the set of his shoulders that he would if she asked him to. "I should speak to him," Eleanor said, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. "You should do whatever feels right to you," the Duke corrected gently, "not whatever feels expected." Eleanor stood, smoothing the front of her green dress with hands that had finally, mostly, stopped shaking, and looked once more at the man who had, 10 minutes earlier, been a complete stranger to her, and was now the only person in that entire garden who had chosen, without hesitation, to stand on her side. "Will I see you again?" she asked, and was faintly surprised at herself for asking it. "I imagine you will," the Duke said, with the faintest suggestion of a smile. "This is a very small county, Mrs. Hartley, and I have a feeling your story is only beginning." Eleanor walked back toward the marquee alone, toward her husband, toward the wreckage of the afternoon still waiting for her among the roses and the string quartet. But for the first time since 6 in the morning, she did not feel entirely without ground beneath her feet. Richard reached her before she had crossed half the lawn, his face arranged into an expression of practiced concern that Alina recognized, now as another performance, no different from the easy charm he wore for his business partners. "Alina, I can explain," he said, low and urgent, glancing around to see who might be listening. "Not here," Alina said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected, steadier than she felt. "Not in front of them. You've done enough damage for one afternoon by saying nothing at the right moment. Don't make it worse now by saying everything at the wrong one." He flinched, and for a moment she saw something like genuine shame move across his face, though she no longer trusted herself to know the difference between his real feelings and the ones he chose to display. They stood there for a long moment, two people who had built a decade together, now separated by a gap neither of them seemed able to cross with words. "We're leaving," Alina said finally, "now." He did not argue. They said their goodbyes to Lady Ashworth, who embraced Alina with unusual warmth and murmured an apology for a mistake that was never hers to make. And by the time they reached the car, the afternoon sun had softened into the long gold light of early evening, indifferent to everything that had happened beneath it. The drive home was silent in a different way than the drive out had been. That morning, silence had been a performance, a mask Alina wore over her discovery. Now the silence was simply exhaustion, two people with nothing left to say that would not cause more damage than it repaired. That night, Alina lay awake long after Richard had fallen into an uneasy sleep beside her, staring at the same ceiling she had stared at for 11 years, trying to locate the exact moment her life had turned into something she no longer recognized. She thought about calling her sister in the next town, but could not yet find the words to explain what had happened without breaking down entirely. And she was not ready, not that first night, to let anyone see how deeply the afternoon had cut. Instead, she lay still, replaying Camille's voice, replaying Richard's silence, replaying the strange, steadying sound of a stranger's voice cutting through the crowd, until exhaustion finally pulled her under sometime near dawn. She woke the next morning to a dozen messages on her phone, some kind, some merely curious, all of them proof that the story had already begun its journey through the county before she had even managed a full night's sleep. She did not answer most of them. She made tea she did not drink, sat at the kitchen table in her dressing gown long after the sun had fully risen, and allowed herself, finally, in the privacy of her own kitchen, to cry the tears she had refused to let the garden see. In the days that followed, the story of the garden party moved through the county exactly as the Duke had predicted, reshaped and retold at every dinner table, every coffee morning, every quiet phone call between old friends. Alina heard fragments of it secondhand, from Margaret, from acquaintances who called under the guise of checking on her welfare while clearly hungry for details. Some versions painted her as pitiable. Others, crueler, suggested she must have known and simply chosen to look away. None of the versions, she noticed, seemed to hold Richard to the same scrutiny that had been turned on her. Camille, for her part, discovered that her calculated cruelty had not produced the result she expected. Rather than establishing herself as a glamorous new fixture in county society, she found doors quietly closing. Invitations that had once arrived with predictable regularity slowed, then stopped. The Arts Council, uncomfortable with the scandal now attached to her name, distanced itself from her projects. Whatever she had hoped to gain from her performance beneath the oak trees, it seemed increasingly clear that she had instead gained a reputation nobody in that world wanted to be associated with. The business consequences arrived more slowly, but they arrived all the same. Two of the investors Richard had spent the afternoon courting withdrew their interest within a fortnight, citing vague concerns about timing, though everyone who mattered understood the real reason without needing it spoken aloud. Men who had once sought Richard out at these gatherings now offered him polite, distant nods across a room and little else. A community that had spent years rewarding his charm now quietly withdrew its goodwill, and Richard, who had built so much of his professional reputation on being liked, found himself, for the first time in his career, unable to charm his way back into anyone's confidence. He tried for a while to pretend the withdrawal was only temporary, a passing storm that would clear once the county found some fresher scandal to discuss. But Alina, watching him from the careful distance she now kept, could see that something in him had begun to understand the size of what he had lost, and it was not simply his marriage. Richard tried, in the days after the party, to return their household to something resembling normal. He brought home flowers Alina did not want. He suggested dinners at restaurants she no longer had any appetite to enjoy. He spoke, when he spoke at all, in careful, rehearsed sentences that sounded exactly like the ones he used with difficult clients. And Alina found she could no longer tell whether he was trying to save their marriage or simply trying to manage a problem, before it cost him something he valued more than her. "I never meant for it to become this," he said one evening, standing in the kitchen doorway while Alina washed dishes she did not need to wash, simply to have something to do with her hands. "It was never supposed to be public." "That's the part that upsets you," Alina said, without turning around. "Not that it happened, that it became public." He did not answer, and his silence told her everything she needed to know. It was Margaret, of all people, who first mentioned that the Duke of Foxmere had been asking after Alina's welfare, casually, at a small gathering the following week, in a way that suggested more than simple courtesy. "He asked if you were well," Margaret said, over tea in Alina's kitchen, her eyes bright with the particular curiosity of a longtime friend sensing a story developing. "Twice, actually. Very properly, of course, but twice." Alina did not know what to make of it, or rather, she knew exactly what to make of it and was not yet ready to examine the feeling that came with the knowledge. In the 2 weeks since the garden party, she had thought of the Duke more often than she cared to admit, not with the giddy excitement of a woman entertaining romantic possibility, but with a quieter, steadier gratitude, the memory of someone who had chosen, without hesitation, to stand beside her when standing beside her cost him nothing, but offered her everything. She saw him again by accident, at a small charity auction held in the village hall, an event so modest compared to the Ashworth garden party that she nearly did not attend at all. He found her near the refreshment table, and this time there was no crowd to interrupt, no crisis to manage, only the ordinary business of two people exchanging polite conversation over lukewarm tea. "You look well," he said, and there was something in the simplicity of the observation that Alina found more comforting than any elaborate compliment could have offered. "I'm managing," she said honestly. "Managing is underrated," the Duke said. "Everyone wants to hear that a person is thriving, as though grief and confusion can be rushed through on a schedule. Managing is honest. I respect honest answers." They talked for nearly an hour about nothing in particular, about the auction items, about the River Restoration Committee, about a dozen small subjects that had no weight to them at all, and Alina found, to her own surprise, that she laughed twice during the conversation. A real laugh, not the careful social version she had performed so often in the weeks since the party. Walking home that evening, she found herself turning the conversation over in her mind, examining it from different angles, not because she was ready to consider anything beyond friendship, but because for the first time in a long while, she had spent an hour in a man's company and not once felt the need to guard herself against disappointment. They met again the following week, and the week after that, always with some small, respectable reason attached, a committee matter to discuss, a book he thought she might enjoy, a walk along the river he claimed he needed company for, though Alina suspected he walked that same stretch of riverbank quite happily alone most mornings. She found herself, without quite deciding to, looking forward to these meetings in a way She had not looked forward to anything in a very long time. There was no urgency to it, no dizzy rush of new romance, only a steady, comfortable warmth that grew a little each time they spoke, the way a garden grows, so slowly that a person barely notices the change until one day the whole shape of it has become something new. She was careful in those months not to lean on him too heavily, not to let him become a replacement for the work she still needed to do on her own account. She continued seeing a counselor in the nearby town every other week, working through the parts of her marriage's collapse that had nothing to do with Camille or the garden party at all. The older wounds, the small erosions of self that had begun long before Richard's affair had ever started. She wanted, when she finally allowed herself to consider something new, to arrive at it whole, not simply desperate to be chosen by someone after feeling so publicly discarded. At home, Richard was waiting, and the sight of him in their kitchen, still trying to reconstruct a version of their marriage that had already ended weeks earlier, made something in Alina finally settle into clarity. "I need you to understand something," she said, before he could begin another rehearsed apology. "This isn't about forgiving what happened at the party. It isn't even about Camille anymore, not really. It's about the fact that when I needed you to stand beside me, in front of everyone who mattered to us, you said nothing. And I have spent every day since then trying to decide whether I can build a life with a man who chooses silence at the exact moment silence costs the most." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Alina held up a hand, not unkindly, simply firmly, the gesture of a woman who had finally finished waiting for someone else to make her decisions for her. "I don't need an answer from you tonight," she said. "I already have mine." The conversation that ended Alina's marriage did not happen in anger. It happened on a quiet Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the garden party, at the same kitchen table where they had shared 11 years of ordinary breakfasts and difficult conversations alike. Richard sat across from her, his hands folded in front of him, looking older than Alina remembered him looking only a month before, as though the weight of the last few weeks had finally caught up with the easy confidence he wore so naturally. "I want a divorce," Alina said, and the words, once spoken aloud, felt lighter than she had expected, as though she had been carrying them for weeks without realizing how heavy they had grown. Richard did not argue. Perhaps he had known this was coming since the moment Camille had spoken beneath the oak trees. Perhaps he had known even before that. In some quiet corner of himself he had chosen not to examine too closely. "I understand," he said finally, and for the first time in weeks, Alina believed something he told her. "I don't hate you," she said, surprising herself with the honesty of it. "I think, in your own way, you loved me, but loving someone and being brave enough to stand beside them in public are two different things, and you only ever managed the first one." The weeks that followed the decision were harder than Alina had anticipated, filled with the practical grief of dividing a shared life, paperwork and phone calls, and awkward conversations with mutual friends who did not know which of them to comfort. There were evenings when she sat alone in the half-packed house on Aldgate Row, surrounded by boxes of a life she was slowly dismantling, and felt the full weight of 11 years pressing down on her chest until she could hardly breathe. Grief, she was learning, did not disappear simply because the decision to leave had been the right one. It only changed shape, settling into corners of her days she had not expected it to reach. A certain song on the radio, the particular smell of the coffee Richard used to make on Sunday mornings, a photograph she found tucked into an old drawer and could not decide whether to keep or discard. She moved out of the house on Aldgate Row, into a smaller cottage on the edge of the village, one with a garden of her own that she began, slowly, to shape into something that belonged entirely to her. The first weeks in the cottage were quiet in a way she had not experienced in over a decade, and the quiet frightened her at first, before it gradually became something closer to peace. She planted roses along the front path, the same variety her mother had once grown, and found a strange comfort in kneeling in the dirt each evening, hands buried in soil that asked nothing of her except patience. Margaret visited often during those early months, bringing casseroles Alina did not need and gossip Alina did not always want, but the company mattered more than either. Slowly, other friendships that had gone quiet during the worst of the scandal began to return as well, tentative at first, then warmer, as the county gradually remembered that Alina Hotley had done nothing at that garden party except stand still and be humiliated, and that there was no shame left to attach to a woman who had handled the aftermath with such visible dignity. Camille Voss, in the end, left the county entirely, her reputation too damaged by her own performance to sustain the social position she had come there to build. Alina heard, second-hand, that she had moved to the city, taken a position with another arts council, and started again somewhere nobody remembered what she had done beneath the oak trees at the Ashworth Garden party. Alina felt, when she heard the news, not triumph exactly, but a kind of quiet release, the sense of a chapter closing without any further need for her own involvement. Richard, for his part, sold his share of the development company he had built and moved to a flat in the city, closer to his business contacts than to the community that had once welcomed him so warmly. Alina heard, occasionally, through the careful gossip of mutual friends, that he had tried twice to rebuild something with Camille after their separate departures from the county, and that both attempts had ended quickly, as though whatever had drawn them together in the first place had never been strong enough to survive outside the drama that created it. Alina, meanwhile, found her days filling slowly with a life she had not expected to build at this point in her years, but one that felt, increasingly, like it belonged entirely to her. She returned to the River Restoration Committee with renewed energy, took on a larger role than she had ever held before, and found, to her quiet satisfaction, that her opinions carried more weight now than they ever had while she stood in Richard's shadow. The Duke of Foxmere remained a presence in her life, though never in the way the county gossip seemed determined to insist upon. He called occasionally, to discuss committee business or simply to ask how her garden was progressing. They met for tea, for walks along the river, for the kind of unhurried conversation that Alina had almost forgotten was possible between two people who wanted nothing from each other beyond honest company. It was nearly a year after the garden party, on a quiet afternoon in her own garden, surrounded by roses she had planted herself, that Alina finally allowed herself to consider what the Duke's steady presence in her life might mean. He had come by to discuss a fundraising proposal, and the conversation had drifted, as it often did now, into something warmer and less formal than business. "You've built something beautiful here," he said, looking around at the garden she had shaped with her own hands over the past year. "I had good reason to learn how," Alina said. "Nobody ever taught me that a life could be rebuilt from nothing until I had no choice but to try." "And what did you learn?" the Duke asked. Alina considered the question for a long moment, watching the late afternoon light move through the roses, remembering the woman she had been a year earlier, standing frozen beneath the oak trees while an entire county watched her marriage collapse in public. She thought of the 4 words on a phone screen, of Camille's careful cruelty, of Richard's terrible silence, and of the stranger who had stepped forward when nobody else would. "I learned that humiliation only has as much power as you allow it to keep," she said finally, "and that the people worth keeping in your life are the ones who stand beside you when it costs them something to do it." The Duke smiled and reached for her hand across the small garden table, and Alina let him take it, no longer the frightened, frozen woman who had stood beneath the oak trees a year before, but someone new, someone who had built her own ground to stand on, and no longer needed anyone's permission to claim it. "I'm not asking you for anything you aren't ready to give," he said quietly. "I only wanted you to know that I'm here whenever, if ever, you decide there's room for me." "There's room," Alina said, surprising herself with how easily the words arrived, how little fear traveled with them. "There has been for a while now. I think I simply needed to finish building myself back up before I let anyone else stand close enough to matter." They sat together as the evening settled over the garden, the roses turning a deeper shade of red in the fading light, and Alina thought, not for the first time, of the woman she had been a year earlier, humiliated in front of a crowd, abandoned by the silence of a husband who had never once found the courage to defend her. That woman felt, now, like someone from an old photograph, familiar but distant, a version of herself she could look back on with compassion rather than shame. The garden party at Ashworth House continued every summer, as it always had, and Alina still attended, though never again as the woman who had once stood humiliated beneath the oak trees. The first time she returned, a year to the day after Camille's cruel little performance, she walked the same lawn in a dress of deep gold, the Duke of Foxmere beside her, and felt none of the old dread that had once followed her through those gates. Lady Ashworth greeted her with a warm embrace and no mention of the past at all, and the guests who had once whispered about her now simply smiled and asked after her garden, her committee work, her evident happiness, as though the whole ugly episode had quietly resolved itself into nothing more than an old story nobody needed to repeat. She walked those grounds now with her head high, her own quiet authority earned through everything she had survived. And if anyone ever asked her about the story that had once traveled through every dinner table in the county, she answered only with a small, unbothered smile, the smile of a woman who had turned her worst afternoon into the beginning of the life she had actually wanted all along. She had learned, in the year since that first terrible summer evening, that the ground beneath her had never truly disappeared. It had only waited, patiently, for her to remember how to stand on it herself.